It's definitely more challenging for people who don't own property to keep up with the rising value of property, especially because at the moment you've got the added challenges of a high interest rate, which means that mortgage payments and interest payments are relatively high. And we're also seeing high rent values, which were up another 0.8% nationally in the month, taking them 8.5% higher over the year. And we're seeing that depleting household savings rates as well in the GDP data. So I think for first home buyers in particular, it's probably never been more challenging to actually access the housing market. And again, it's reflected in falling rates of home ownership over time as well.
And Eliza, we're seeing some massive increases here. In places like Perth, prices have surged 21% in the past year. Is there any hope for the youngish generation, i.e. people like you and me?
Well, I think that the nature of the housing market is that it's become less about how hard you're working and how much you're saving, and more about, who your parents are and what kind of assistance you can access in the market. So in a city like Perth, or Adelaide is another good example where median home values have risen around $300,000 since the onset of the pandemic. It really helps if you have someone who can help you with the equity in their home or downsizing and gifting money. We've seen a lot of that come into more literature as well, research documenting the bank of mum and dad, and we're seeing it in some bank reports now as well. And I think that's where some of the government schemes we've seen come into play in the past few years have been increasingly important, or things like the proposed Help to Buy, where the government can kind of act as that leg up, or, that pseudo bank of mum and dad for those that don't actually have it.
The bank of mum and dad, never been more important than now. So we know the supply of housing is nowhere near enough for Australia's fast-growing population, hence the rapid price increases we're seeing. Now I'm curious, how much of this is due to NIMBYs or the not in my backyard mentality, people opposing new developments?
Look, I think a lot of the supply-demand dynamic is also coming from people who are not willing to sell their home because they have no incentive to, and it's a tight market still. So people who, even if they're ready to downsize, they might find that the market is such that there's nothing for them to move into. I think debates around YIMBYism, they're important and they play a role in increasing housing supply. But, planning reforms and higher density aren't going to fix things like the high interest rate environment, which limits feasibility even for high density projects right now. It's not going to bring down the cost of construction, and it's not going to increase capacity in the construction industry either. So there's a lot you can look at on the supply side to boost more housing and accommodation that doesn't just come back to the planning and density space.
And where do you see interest rates heading for the rest of this year, and how might that affect house prices going forward?
Yes, with the start of the year, there was this real confidence from inflation coming in under the RBA's forecast that interest rates could come down as soon as Q4 this year. Since we got a slightly higher inflation print for the quarter, that forecast has really fanned out from anywhere that cut is maintained in Q4 to the rates will be held until Q1 next year to we could even see an increase in interest rates towards the end of this year. Despite the variation in forecasts, I think ultimately the uncertainty there is going to have an impact on consumer sentiment, and that could flow through to housing demand. It won't happen as quickly as what we see in something like the stock market, which is a lot more liquid and reflexive to this kind of economic news, but I think it could start to dampen conditions towards the end of the year.
And finally, I also noticed rents also went up at an even faster pace than property prices last month. I mean, how sustainable is this? Do you think we'll reach a point where tenants simply can't afford these massive rent increases anymore?
I think we're already at a point where tenants can't afford massive rent increases that have been observed over the past few years. And that's why you're seeing things like an increased reliance on specialist homelessness services or people sleeping rough or finding abandoned properties to occupy. It's a really bad situation in the rental market. And despite the fact that we've seen people moving to more affordable parts of the country, and ABS data has indicated a bit of a rise in share housing as well, it's just not been enough to cope with the unrelenting demand that we're seeing in the form of this temporary spike in net overseas migration. So I think once that normalizes, and the Centre for Population expects that that could be as soon as 2025, we won't really get the kind of relief in the rental space that I think a lot of tenants are after. But again, it does unfortunately take a long time to address housing and rental affordability issues that have been the result of successive government failures for decades to supply adequate social and affordable housing.
Well, it looks like tenants and prospective home buyers will have to hang on for a little bit longer. Eliza, thanks a lot for your insights.
Thanks for having me. Take care.